The studio lights were warm, almost comforting, casting a soft glow across the familiar set of the view. Blake Shelton walked out to applause, offering his trademark half-wave, half-shrug, the kind that always made him seem like he'd rather be anywhere else than under bright lights, yet somehow belonged there anyway. He took his seat, boots planted firmly on the floor, hands resting loosely on his knees. There was an easy confidence about him, the calm of someone who had faced roaring stadiums and unforgiving critics alike. At first, the conversation flowed smoothly. They talked about music, about touring, about the strange feeling of writing songs that millions of people somehow made their own. Blake cracked a joke about being more comfortable on a tractor than on a talk show couch, drawing laughter from the audience and smiles from the panel. Joy Behar leaned back, nodding along, her expression unreadable but attentive. As the minutes passed, the discussion drifted, as it often did, from music into broader territory. Fame, responsibility, public voices. Blake answered thoughtfully, choosing his words with care, aware that anything said on this stage could echo far beyond the studio walls. He spoke about growing up in a small town, about learning early that opinions carried weight, especially when people listened whether you wanted them to or not. The audience hummed with interest, clapping at familiar points, murmuring agreement when his story struck close to home. Then Joy leaned forward, elbows resting on the table, her voice sharper than before. She shifted the topic toward Blake's public comments and the expectations placed on celebrities. The warmth in the room cooled slightly. Blake smiled, trying to keep the mood light, responding with a joke that danced around the question instead of landing squarely on it. Some audience members laughed, but the laughter didn't spread the way it had earlier. Joy pressed again, rephrasing, her tone firm, almost challenging. She wasn't smiling now. Blake adjusted in his chair, sensing the change. He answered more directly this time, explaining that he believed people should be allowed to hold different views without being labeled or dismissed. He spoke calmly, hands moving subtly as he emphasized his point. For a moment, it seemed like the tension might ease. Another host nodded, trying to bridge the gap, but Joy interrupted, cutting in before Blake could finish his sentence. The interruption landed hard. A faint ripple of surprise moved through the audience. Blake paused, his mouth still slightly open as if the rest of his thought had been caught midair. He closed it, inhaled slowly, then looked straight at Joy. His expression had changed. The easygoing charm was still there, but now it was layered with something firmer, something unyielding. He tried again, starting his sentence from the beginning, but Joy jumped in once more, her words overlapping his. The exchange began to feel less like a discussion and more like a tug of war, each side pulling harder, neither willing to let go. The studio grew quieter, the kind of quiet that isn't peaceful but expectant. Even the audience members who had been nodding enthusiastically earlier now sat still, eyes flicking between Blake and Joy. Blake's voice remained steady, but the humor had drained out of it. He explained that he respected differing opinions, but he didn't appreciate being spoken over. His words were measured, not loud, but they carried weight. Joy responded instantly, defending her approach, insisting that tough questions were part of the job. Behind the cameras, producers shifted uneasily. A few crew members exchanged glances, fingers hovering near switches, ready to cut to commercial if needed. Blake leaned back slightly, exhaling through his nose. He smiled again, but this time the smile didn't reach his eyes. He made one more attempt to lighten the mood, tossing out a line about debates being more intense than songwriting sessions. The audience chuckled politely, but the tension lingered like static in the air. Joy wasn't finished. She leaned in again, voice rising just enough to signal frustration. She challenged Blake's stance more directly now, her words sharper, her delivery faster. Blake listened without interrupting, jaw tightening almost imperceptibly. When she finished, he nodded slowly, then spoke. He said he had no problem with hard questions, but he believed respect went both ways. He pointed out that conversations worked best when everyone was allowed to finish a thought. His tone wasn't angry, but it was firm, unmistakably so. The moment stretched. No one else on the panel jumped in. The audience waited, breath held. Joy responded, dismissing his concern with a wave of her hand, saying interruptions were part of lively debate. That was when something shifted decisively. Blake's shoulders straightened. He sat up, eyes steady, voice low but clear. He said he'd spent his life listening to people talk over one another, shouting past instead of understanding, and he wasn't interested in doing that on a show meant to bring people together. A murmur rippled through the crowd, louder this time. Blake's words weren't explosive, but they were honest, and honesty often hits harder than volume. Joy opened her mouth to respond, but Blake continued, finishing his thought without raising his voice. He emphasized that disagreement didn't require disrespect. The silence that followed was heavy, thick enough to feel. The easy, friendly interview that had begun only minutes earlier felt like a distant memory. As Blake finished speaking, he leaned back slightly, folding his hands together, as if waiting to see what would come next. The cameras lingered on his face, then cut briefly to Joy, whose expression was tight, controlled. The atmosphere in the studio was no longer warm. It was charged, uncertain, teetering on the edge of something bigger. And in that moment, everyone could sense that whatever happened next would not be easily forgotten. The silence didn't last long, but it felt endless. Joy straightened in her chair, lips pressed together before she spoke again, this time slower, more deliberate. She said she wasn't trying to be disrespectful, only honest, only doing what viewers expected from the show. Her words were controlled, but the edge remained. Blake listened, eyes fixed on her, nodding once as if acknowledging the point without accepting it. The audience shifted, some clapping lightly, others staying still, unsure which side to take. The energy in the room had changed completely. This was no longer an interview. It was a standoff. One of the other hosts tried to step in, offering a neutral comment about how passionate conversations could sometimes get messy. It was meant to soften the moment, to guide the discussion back to safer ground, but it barely made a dent. Joy responded quickly, circling back to her original point, and once again Blake attempted to answer. Once again, his words were cut short. That was the moment the calm finally cracked. Blake didn't raise his voice, didn't slam his hand on the table, but he did stop mid-thought and sit there, staring ahead for a long second. When he spoke again, his tone had changed. It wasn't defensive anymore, it was resolved. He said he'd come on the show to talk about music and life, not to be cornered or talked over. He reminded everyone that disagreement didn't have to turn into confrontation, that conversations could be firm without being dismissive. The audience reacted audibly now, a mix of applause and murmurs blending together. Joy shook her head slightly, clearly unimpressed, and replied that public figures didn't get to choose only comfortable conversations. Blake nodded slowly, absorbing her words. Then he did something no one expected. He pushed his chair back just a few inches and placed his hands on the armrests, grounding himself. He thanked Joy for her honesty, thanked the panel for having him, and said, calmly, that he didn't feel this conversation was going anywhere productive. There was no anger in his voice, just a clear sense of finality. The audience gasped softly, realizing what was about to happen before it actually did. A producer's voice crackled faintly through the studio speakers, urging everyone to take a breath, suggesting they move on. But Blake was already standing. The scrape of his chair against the floor echoed louder than it should have, cutting through the tension like a blade. He adjusted his jacket, glanced once at the audience, and offered a small, polite smile. Then he turned back toward the table. His eyes met Joy's for a brief second. There was no glare, no triumph, just disappointment. Joy opened her mouth as if to say something, but Blake had already stepped away from the table. One of the hosts reached out slightly, a gesture halfway between stopping him and saying goodbye. He nodded to her, appreciative but unmoved. The cameras stayed on him as he walked toward the edge of the set, boots heavy against the floor. The applause that followed was hesitant at first, then grew louder, fueled by shock more than celebration. As Blake disappeared off camera, the show cut abruptly to a commercial break. Behind the scenes, the energy was frantic. Producers whispered urgently, assistants rushed across the floor, and crew members avoided eye contact, all aware they had just witnessed a moment that would live far beyond the studio. Joy sat back in her chair, exhaling sharply, her expression tight. When the cameras came back, Blake's seat was conspicuously empty. Joy addressed the audience with a practiced smile, calling the exchange a passionate moment, and emphasizing the importance of open dialogue. Her words were smooth, but the atmosphere remained unsettled. Viewers at home could feel it, the unspoken weight of what had just happened. The panel moved on to the next topic, but the rhythm was off, the laughter forced, the energy fractured. Within minutes of the broadcast ending, clips of the confrontation began spreading online. Social media lit up with arguments, hashtags forming instantly. Some praised Blake for standing his ground and walking away with dignity. Others accused him of avoiding tough questions. Joy faced her own wave of reactions, supporters applauding her directness, critics calling her approach aggressive. The debate exploded, fueled by short video clips and out-of-context quotes, each side convinced they were right. Blake didn't post anything that night. No statement, no clarification. Instead, he was spotted later leaving the studio quietly, head down, slipping into a waiting car. Those close to him said he was calm, reflective, more tired than angry. He believed he'd said what he needed to say, and he wasn't interested in fanning the flames. The silence only made the moment louder. In the days that followed, the incident was dissected endlessly. Talk shows replayed it, commentators slowed it down frame by frame, analyzing expressions, pauses, tone. What could have been a forgettable interview became a cultural flashpoint about respect, conversation, and the limits of debate. Blake returned to his music, performing to packed crowds who cheered a little louder than usual, some holding signs referencing the walkout. Joy addressed the moment briefly on air later, standing by her role while acknowledging that things had escalated. But for many viewers, the image that lingered wasn't the argument itself. It was Blake standing up quietly, choosing to leave rather than shout, and the empty chair left behind when the cameras came back on. In a world full of noise, that absence spoke volumes. The episode became a reminder that sometimes the most powerful statement isn't made with words at all, but with the decision to step away when a conversation loses its respect.